Conversations, episode 15. First-time listeners, welcome in, and long-time listeners, welcome back. If you are a long-time listener, apologies. I was expecting to have this episode be right after the college football playoff bracket was released, and unfortunately, due to some time constraints and other responsibilities, I was unable to do that. So this is the rather late program for the Conversations reaction to the college football playoff and the college football postseason as a whole. Before we dive into everything today, and there is a lot to cover, make sure that you hit that subscribe button wherever you are listening. We are on all of the major podcast listening platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio. And if there is one that you want to listen to that we are not on today, give us a shout. Let us know. We'll do our best to get on there as quickly as we can. We are also on all of the major social media platforms except for TikTok. Follow us on Facebook. That's just Conversations, not Around the Corn Sports blog, but follow that too if you would like. We are on X at kbex_ATC. We are on Instagram at cornversationspod. And of course, if you want to interact with the podcast and send a mailbag question, you can do so on any of those platforms on our listening platform, or you can send a mailbag question to cornversationspod@gmail.com. Appreciate all of you guys hitting that subscribe button, liking, interacting, sending us mailbag questions. That is what makes this show go. It is what is going to make this show continue to improve in the future. So thank you very much for your listenership, and hopefully we've got a really good show in store for you guys. As I mentioned, it's going to be all about college football. We are reacting to the playoff, which has not yet started, so luckily we got this episode in time. What I did not get in time was an opportunity to talk about Bowl Mania, which is one of my favorite times of the year. I am still going to talk about that a little bit. I'm going to plug Bowl Mania. I still believe in it. It is not dead, in my opinion. And so I'll give you some of my favorite games of the bowl season outside of the playoff games that I think you should consider watching if you were just going to completely skip that schedule outside of the games that are part of the CFP. So we'll break it down this way. We'll talk about the college football playoff first, a little bit of a late or delayed reaction to some things, but I think that's honestly an opportunity for us to take maybe a different look at it based on being able to respond to some of what's already been out there. And then we'll go ahead and we'll do a re-rack or a rewind of what I had predicted for the college football playoff, a little bit of where Becks was right, where Becks was wrong, and we'll see how I did there. And then we will dive into the Bowl Mania top games to pay attention to this bowl season. So, college football playoff. The time is finally upon us. Can't believe that the season, it feels like it's gone very quickly, but here we are. We are just about a week away from the first round games kicking off. And of course, without fail, despite having 12 teams now participating in the playoff and having a chance to win the national title, we had controversy. And we knew this was going to come. So this is not any surprise whatsoever. But the fact that it has sparked so much reaction, particularly from one program, is, I think, what's interesting about this year's selection. And just to give a little bit of a brief synopsis of what we've been dealing with, and we're about a week on from the selections being made, the biggest snub, if you want to call it, or the biggest snub according to them, was Notre Dame being left out after having been in the playoff just a week prior and not having played a game during championship week. And in addition to Notre Dame having not played a game during championship week, the teams that they were seemingly left out instead of, that being Miami and Alabama, either did not play a game during championship week in the case of Miami, and in the case of Alabama, they lost by multiple touchdowns in the SEC title game. So not a good look by one team in their opportunity to have a last data point, and in the case of Miami, they were doing the same thing that Notre Dame was doing heading into that week, and yet, despite being ranked behind Notre Dame coming into championship weekend, the Hurricanes jumped Notre Dame the following week. And not surprisingly, Notre Dame did not take that well. It started innocently enough, I suppose you could say. It was shock and awe, if you want to call it that, by both the fan base and the team. But a few hours after the bracket was announced and released, Notre Dame announced that they would not be participating in the postseason at all. So no bowl game for the Fighting Irish. It was announced that the team had made that decision, which I don't believe at all. I think you've got a bunch of players in that locker room that probably wanted to play. There's a handful of those guys that are not going to put on the uniform again. There's a handful of guys that are not going to play football again, given that this would have been their last game of collegiate eligibility, and they're not going to go on and play in the pros. So to say that the team made this decision and it was players and coaches that ultimately decided they were not going to participate in the postseason that is largely broadcast by ESPN and their partners is pretty unlikely in my estimation. So we had that. Okay, we can let that go because there's a number of other teams that decided they weren't going to play in postseason games either, and there's a lot of questions about whether or not the bowl season is relevant if you're not in the playoff. Okay, fine. We can let that one go. But it got worse. The next day, it was, I would say, quietly announced. It was not something that got as much attention as I feel like it would have had there not already been some noise coming from the program and their decision to not play in the postseason. But it was announced the next day that next season, so starting in 2026, if Notre Dame were to be ranked in the top 12 in the final college football playoff rankings, which is something that they were this year, but because of automatic bids, they were not allotted one of the at-large bids. But if next season the same thing happens, that Notre Dame is ranked in the top 12, they will automatically receive a bid to the college football playoff. And additionally, if the playoff were to expand to 14 or more teams, then Notre Dame would also be allotted an automatic bid to the playoff if it were ranked 13th or better. So an interesting wrinkle here that Notre Dame, despite not being in a conference, is still getting preferential treatment, and they're building upon that preferential treatment. But it did not stop there. There was more. After that announcement, Notre Dame's athletic director, Pete Bavacqua, who has really been leading the charge with a lot of these media hailstorm aspects, if you want to call it that, put out into the ether that because of the ACC's supposed promotion of Miami over Notre Dame, that Notre Dame was reconsidering its relationship with the ACC, mentioning that it had been severely affected by the situation that occurred on Sunday when the bracket was released. And I think this is the most interesting portion of, as I mentioned, the hailstorm of events that have occurred regarding Notre Dame since the bracket was released, because it's kind of rich that you're hearing from a program that has had multiple opportunities to join a conference. This is not something where they have been repeatedly declining opportunities. They have actually, excuse me. They've been repeatedly declining opportunities to join a conference because in their mind it has made sense to go it alone. And we're not going to get into the reasons why it makes sense. I mean, you guys know those reasons. But in terms of making the claim that the ACC's relationship has been harmed because of what they supposedly did regarding promoting Miami is kind of laughable, frankly, because you've got a conference in the ACC that was going to get left out if Miami was not in the playoff, and you've got a situation where Notre Dame is not a full-fledged member, so they're not adding to the pool monetarily the same way that the rest of these schools are. So if you're Notre Dame, I don't know how you can make the claim that you should be treated the same way as every other member of that conference when you are, by definition, not the same as every other member of that conference. And I think this is where the last portion of the hailstorm makes a lot of sense, which is that there was a report by Ross Dellinger that came out later in the week that said that there are athletic directors across the country that are considering freezing Notre Dame out of future schedules because of the comments that they've made related to the ACC and just in general the approach that they've taken with regards to going out into the media saying that they've been wronged as a result of the selection committee's decision to leave them out of this year's playoff. And with all of this information, there's been lots of opinions that have been thrown around, but I think the best one that I heard in the past week came from Joel Klatt's podcast. And this was specific to talking about the playoff itself and why Notre Dame and maybe some fans, whether they're Notre Dame fans or not, had a problem with the way that things transpired in the final selection rankings. And what Klatt had compared this situation to was making a hot dog or making a sausage, right? Lots of people like hot dogs, lots of people like sausages, but the old adage is you don't want to know how the hot dog or how the sausage is actually made. And the reason that he compared it in this way is he said, look, throughout the season, we have these weekly ranking shows where we are supposedly being told what position each team holds according to the selection committee. And the problem with having that is that when you get to the end of the season and you have a situation like we did this year where two teams who had played each other head-to-head on the field were right next to each other in the rankings. And the rankings, if they had not gone the way that they did in reality, would have made no sense based on the on-the-field results of these games. And so we're, of course, talking about the early season matchup, first game of the season, in fact, between Miami and Notre Dame. And Miami won that game, straight up, head-to-head. But up until this past week, Notre Dame was ahead of Miami in the rankings. And I've heard a lot of opinions about make it make sense. How can you jump a team over another team when both teams were not playing? Where's the data point that supports that? And, of course, the data point that supports that is first game of the season. And what Klatt was saying was, hey, look, you can have these ranking shows. You can have everybody talking about the rankings for the second half of the season, and that's all well and good if you're ESPN and you're trying to make ad revenue and you're trying to get people interested in talking about the sport for several weeks out of the season in a way that they may not if there isn't a weekly ranking show. But the risk that you run by showing everybody how the sausage is made is that they're not going to like it. And then they may even question, do we like sausage at all? And that's essentially what you've got going on right now, is Notre Dame was upset by the fact that the sausage being made gave the illusion that they were going to be in this playoff, when in reality, because of the way that things worked out, if they ended up next to Miami and they had to consider head-to-head results, which they really should be doing all along, and they probably were, but the rankings weren't showing that ultimately they were going to be the one who was hosed in this situation. And so I agree with Klatt there. I think that is the biggest reason why Notre Dame has such an issue with this. But to go scorched earth on ESPN and the ACC and the selection process as a whole is really not a great look by a program that has been taking advantage of lots of loopholes in this system for a very long time. There is no other team in the country who will be assured a playoff bid if they are in the top 12 come next season. There just isn't. And if you want to say, well, Power 4 conferences, they're assured. No, they're not. Because the ACC did not get their conference representative, their conference champion, into the playoff this year. Now, how do you solve this situation? Joel Klatt said, okay, well, maybe we just don't have the rankings shows. I don't think that's a realistic solution to this, because in the end, you're asking ESPN to take away something that's drawing a lot of eyeballs throughout the regular season. You're asking college football to move away from something that has really become part of the fabric of the game, which is the fact that it is a soap opera for a large portion of the season in a way that the NFL is not. They need these rankings shows. It's part of what makes people interested in the game. And yes, you're going to have these situations happen again, most likely, and it's not going to be comfortable for the selection committee, and it's going to be difficult to explain for the talking heads on ESPN, and it's going to be painful for a program that loses out on a playoff bid because of it. However, it's part of what makes college football to have this aspect of these talking points throughout the regular season, and I don't think that it's realistic that they're going to get rid of this, despite the fact that it is the main cause of Notre Dame being upset. But while Notre Dame might be the loudest in the room, and that's why we're giving them the most attention, at least from a mainstream media perspective, I want to look at perhaps the overlooked aspects or the overlooked team that also got hosed in this situation. So let's start with the team that I think got the most hosed. And yes, Notre Dame has an argument, but I think that you can also look at BYU and you can say they also got the short end of the stick for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you're looking at BYU's schedule this year, they have lost to one team all season, Texas Tech. And yes, it wasn't close either situation. They were blown out in Lubbock. They were blown out in the Big 12 title game. But that is one team on their schedule that they have lost to this season. And when you're talking about Notre Dame and their two losses to two different teams, yes, which also are in the playoff, you're looking at a situation where it's a lot closer, in my opinion, than we're talking about, because Notre Dame's schedule was really not all that stronger than BYU's schedule. And when you take out those losses, both teams won all their games. So, call it a weak argument if you will, but I don't really think that BYU's body of work was all that much worse than Notre Dame's body of work. And when you're talking about best wins, BYU has a very good win over a Utah team that was right there in the mix near the end of the season for a playoff bid as well. Secondarily, and I think this is possibly the bigger aspect of why this is overlooked and why I think it could be an indication of what we were trying to, or what college football was trying to maintain moving forward, is you've got a team in BYU that got into their conference title game. And the committee was very clear last year in saying that the conference title games were an additional data point, and they were not an opportunity for teams to get hurt by playing in that extra game. But clearly, this season, that is not the case, because you had a team in BYU that was in the top 12 heading into championship weekend, and because of their loss to Texas Tech, a team that they had already lost to, they were ultimately left out of the playoff. And I think what it really came down to, if you look at the situations, is that one of two teams that played in a conference title game this year that lost convincingly in their conference title game were going to be left out of the playoff. And it was either BYU or Alabama. And Alabama, yes, had a win earlier in the season over the team that they lost to by multiple touchdowns in the SEC title game. But what we're also having to consider here is that because a team was going to get left out of the playoff as a result of a loss in the conference title game, it was going to bring up the question as to whether or not it even made sense to be playing in that title game at all. And I think that it would have been a much bigger story nationally if Alabama, playing in the SEC, had been left out of the college football playoff after having been in the playoff as an at-large selection, according to the rankings prior to championship weekend, because of the conference that they play in. I think that this would have been a much bigger story if we would have been talking about whether or not the SEC title game even has a place in college football. Because, frankly, I don't think that college football, the SEC, the playoff structure at this point is ready to consider a situation where conference title games are not being played. I do think that conference title games are eventually going to go the way of the dodo, but they're not ready yet to make that happen, because there's other things that you have to consider when you're just going to get rid of a game, when you're going to get rid of that revenue, when you're going to get rid of that possibility that the team who wins that game is given an automatic bid to the playoff. You're going to have to tweak a lot of things if you're going to get rid of conference title games. So I think that people are generally overlooking the fact that the Big 12 title game essentially did not matter this year. Because if it did matter, based on what we heard from the selection committee last year, BYU should not have been punished as a result of losing that game, even losing the way that they did. And then we've got to, of course, look at the long-term situation here about what probably will change as a result of what has happened with this year's playoff bracket. And that is the G5 inclusion into this playoff. I've heard a lot of different opinions about the G5 teams being included in the playoff. I don't agree with a lot of them. My take on the situation is that the G5 contingency should be allotted a slot into the playoff. I don't think that them playing an entirely separate playoff is going to be good for those teams and those programs, because despite arguably a different game being played compared to your big boys in the Power 4 conferences, they are still in that division. And if you take them out of the consideration to play in the playoff, then why are they playing in FBS division at all? Why are we not just splitting the division into multiple sectors? So they're not ready to make that decision yet. I don't think that we should be ready to call for the G5 spot to be totally eradicated under the current structure. However, this was not a good year for there to be two teams from the G5 ranks getting into the playoff. It is the way that the structure is set up. There's really nothing that we could have done or that the selection committee could have done. It's just the way that the cookie crumbled this year. But when you look at some years, there are a number of G5 teams that have an argument for being capable of competing with a lot of Power 4 schools. This was not one of those years. With all due respect to James Madison and Tulane, they are two teams that were sitting outside of the top 20 up until the last week of the season. Nobody was looking at them as potential playoff busters, the way that last year we were looking at a team like Boise State, who legitimately deserved a shot at the playoff. They were a top 12 team going into the final week of the rankings. This year, that was not the case. So, while I'm a huge proponent of the G5 teams being in the playoff in some way, I do think it is almost a little bit damaging that they got two in this year, because this was not the year that two teams from the G5 ranks really deserve to be in the playoff. That's not to say that that doesn't ever happen, but this was not one of them. And so I wonder whether or not we're going to see slight tweaks that prevent this type of thing from happening again. I think if anything happens in the short term, that would be the thing that would make the most sense in terms of inclusion into the playoff. I think the Notre Dame situation actually makes less sense, but here we are learning in this past week that that is the case, where Notre Dame has a guaranteed spot if they're in the top 12. Okay, so that's the initial reaction on the playoff. Let's take a look back at what I had predicted for the playoff. And if you recall from earlier episodes, I had a preseason top 12 where I was giving you my thoughts about the playoff teams before the season began, and then we re-racked and we did a midseason report where I revised those rankings and gave you my updated predictions. So a little bit of Becks right, Becks wrong going on here. We'll go ahead and we will start with the preseason rankings. I did get 4 out of 12 correct, so a third of the teams I predicted correctly would make it, but I only had one team that was in their exact position. So just as a recap, my preseason top 12 had Penn State at number 1, Notre Dame at number 2, Georgia at number 3, Clemson at number 4, Alabama at number 5, Texas at number 6, Iowa State at number 7, Ohio State at number 8, Oklahoma at number 9, Illinois at number 10, Utah at number 11, and Boise State rounding out the field at number 12. And the 4 teams, of course, that I had predicted correctly were Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, and Oklahoma. Georgia being the number 3 seed, so I pegged that one entirely correctly. And Oklahoma at the 9 seed, I almost got that one correctly, and I think that was probably my best pick, if you want to call it that, because not very many people had Oklahoma making the playoff this season, but I was high on John Mateer coming into the year, and I really think that or thought, I suppose, that Brent Venables needed a good season to take some of the heat off of him down in Norman. The midseason got a little bit better, not surprisingly. I got 8 out of the 12 correctly. My top 12 at the midpoint was Ohio State at number 1, Miami at number 2, Alabama at number 3, Texas Tech at number 4, Indiana at number 5, Georgia at number 6, Oregon at number 7, Notre Dame at number 8, Texas A&M at number 9, Tennessee at number 10, Utah at number 11, and Memphis at 12, being the G5 representative. I think it was pretty self-explanatory at the time, and I did go into the logic in the midseason report episode. Ohio State being number 1, head and shoulders above everybody else at the midseason point. I also believed that they were going to win the Big Ten title game, and that would have put them solidly at that number 1 spot. Really, all you had here was Ohio State and Indiana kind of flip-flopping, but Ohio State getting the number 2 seed in reality, I think, makes a lot of sense there. I did have Texas Tech at number 4 correctly. I just looked at them as kind of being the most likely participant coming out of the Big 12, and given the general perception of the Big 12 this season, I felt like of the Power 4 conferences, they were the most likely to end up at the bottom of that pecking order. But Miami at number 2 was kind of something that threw that for a wrench, because obviously they didn't get into the ACC title game. Still making the playoff, though, but at the number 10 slot as an at-large. I did come around on Oregon midseason. I did not believe in them to begin the year, but it looked very much like they were going to be a playoff team after their performances in the first half of the season. And so I could not deny them a second time. I think the worst pick that I had, and maybe to go back, starting with my preseason, of course, Penn State at number 1 was not good. Clemson at number 4 was bad. Iowa State at number 7 looked good for the first several weeks of the season, and then really the bottom dropped out there. So that was a little bit unfortunate to watch that unravel, because I felt good about Iowa State going into the year. But as we've seen time and time again, Matt Campbell was unable to get the job done when it really mattered most at Iowa State, and I think perhaps maybe he even realized that as well, and that's why he's moving on from the program. Tennessee at number 10 in my mid-season report was probably the worst that I had at that point in the year. I thought that Tennessee was going to be a team that could overwhelm teams offensively, but it became clear as the season went on that because of the defensive deficiencies, they really were not one of the best teams in the SEC, and their weaknesses were exposed by a number of participants as the year went on. So I was wrong there. I had pegged them incorrectly, but I did like what I saw from them, especially in the first half of their game against Georgia, which I think is really what kind of sold me on them as a team that could fight for one of those playoff spots. And then as far as the G5 participant is concerned, Boise State at the beginning of the season was kind of a throw a flyer on the team that made the playoff last year, but they did not have a banner year by any stretch of the imagination. And then Memphis in the midseason report was playing the best out of the teams from the American Conference, and I think that I was correct in my assertion that the American Conference was the best G5 league in the country this year. It was just a matter of who was going to make it out of that conference. And as it turned out, there was a ton of competition, especially at the top. You had Memphis, you had USF as a very good team, you had Navy, you had North Texas, and you had Tulane. And so there were a number of teams that ultimately had a legitimate shot of coming out of that conference to win. And it was tooth and nail all the way till the end. They had tiebreakers ultimately determine who ended up making that conference title game. And so Memphis being in that spot I don't think was a horrible choice. I was actually kind of surprised at the way that Memphis ended the season. They had a couple of games that they dropped there that I thought they would win, and ultimately that opened the door for Tulane and North Texas to get back into the conference title game. And Tulane ultimately was probably the most consistent team on both sides of the ball this year. So, not horrible, I wouldn't say, as far as predictions are considered for the year. But it also wasn't a great showing either from a preseason perspective. The Penn State and Clemson inclusion in the top 4 are going to be looked back on, I think, by readers of Around the Corn Sports blog and you listeners here as 2 of my not so great takes as far as college football predictions are concerned. But as we move along here in the show, I do want to give a little bit of love to bowl season outside of the college football playoff. I have heard a lot from a lot of different people that bowl season is dead, that it doesn't make sense to pay attention to it anymore, that the Bowl Mania game that ESPN puts on isn't worth the time that it takes to fill out all of the games. And I just want to get on my soapbox for a minute and let you all know that if you have those opinions, you are wrong. You are categorically incorrect about those takes as far as Bowl Mania is concerned. I do think that bowl season is still very much alive. I don't see it going away anytime in the near future. I really don't even see it being tweaked in a major way in the near future because it is not something that is impeding college football from moving forward. In the end, yes, you have teams that are declining bowl bids because of the number of players that may be moving on to another program or a coach that's moved on, or in the case of Notre Dame, they just took their ball and went home. But the Notre Dame case is pretty unusual. I do think that that's going to remain an unusual case. And so I don't see Bowl Mania and bowl season being a situation where the vast majority of teams are declining. I still think that you're going to get teams who are going to look at this as an opportunity to bring in the younger guys for extra practices, to get in a look at them heading into the next season. And ultimately, it's an opportunity to see some decent football as we wind down the year. And that's why I've put together my top 10 list of bowl games outside of the college football playoff games that I think you guys should take a look at as something that potentially you'll sit down and have a watch, because it is being overlooked. And because of the number of games, I think it is a little bit difficult to cipher through and figure out which ones you want to watch, because it's almost impossible to watch them all. But I think that there are a handful of them that are worth watching. So I'm going to do a little countdown here, a 10-1 of my top 10 bowl games to watch this bowl season. And we're going to start with one that actually comes near the end of the bowl season, and that's the main reason why I'm including it on this list, the Trust and Will Holiday Bowl, which is a January 2nd bowl game. And the reason that I included this on the list is that it is the last non-playoff bowl game of the season. So for me, I always kind of look at this game as a little bit of a it's a little bit bittersweet to watch this, because you know how close the end of the season actually is. And whereas in the playoff games, you're looking at 2 matchups, or in the case of the semifinals, you're looking at 2 matchups that are going to ultimately determine a national champion. So, you're not really thinking about that aspect of it almost being the end of the season. I think with this bowl game, you definitely will. So take a look at this one. Consider it. It's a Friday night. It's after New Year's. There isn't going to be a whole heck of a lot going on for most people. So I think it's a worthwhile game to watch. And Arizona and SMU didn't have bad seasons either. They're 2 pretty decent teams. So I think it could be a very good game on the field as well. Number 9, we have the Isleta, New Mexico Bowl. And this is between North Texas and San Diego State It is a December 27th bowl game, so it's right smack in the middle of the bowl season. And the reason I pulled this one out is that I've kind of had a soft spot for North Texas this year. I really like what they have done offensively. They're a little bit inconsistent. They do turn the ball over, but they are a heck of a lot of fun to watch when they are humming. And I think it's going to be interesting to watch them go up against San Diego State, which has had one of the best defenses in the G5 ranks this year. So you're really pitting strength on strength in this game, and these are two of the better G5 teams that you would come across the landscape of college football this season. So number 8, I've got the Liberty Mutual Music City Bowl. That is between Tennessee and Illinois. That is a December 30th game. I think this one, for me, I look at this as one of the earlier heavy hitter games between Power 5 conference teams. There's going to be a lot of orange in the stands, and you're looking at two teams that I don't think quite met the expectations that they had for themselves this year, but you're looking at two teams that, when they are playing well and firing on all cylinders, I think could have competed with any team in the country this year. So hopefully they'll be ready to play, and we'll see a true representation of what these teams could have been this year, and I think we'll get a very good game in Nashville if that does happen. Moving right along to number 7, I've got the Hawaii Bowl, and this is a Christmas Eve game for me, and if my wife ever listens to these shows or this podcast in particular, she will hate me for saying this, but she's heard it before. Because she asked me, she said, well, what are your family's traditions for Christmas and Christmas Eve? And honestly, we didn't have a ton of them that I could remember, but one that I kind of made up myself was sitting down and watching the Hawaii Bowl on Christmas Eve. It is the only consistent thing that I can remember doing from about the time that I was 14 years old until I left my parents' house. And so this one always will hold a soft spot in my heart. And frankly speaking, what else is going on Christmas Eve? This game starts at 8 p.m. Eastern time. So this is a game that's going to bleed into Christmas Day. What actually are you doing? There is nothing else on television as far as sports is concerned. So if you're a sports junkie or you're a person who is just kind of sick of the Christmas movies, this is a game that's going to give you an opportunity to have a breath of fresh air, if you will. And also, the matchup isn't bad either. You've got Hawaii back in this game facing Cal, who's going to be led by a former Hawaii quarterback. So there's some familiarity there on the sidelines as well. So I think it's a good game on the field, in addition to the fact that you're not really competing with anything from a sports perspective on Christmas Eve. Number 6, I've got the Bad Boy Mowers Pinstripe Bowl. And the reason I picked this one out is because it is a game that I think a lot of us, including myself, would have been expecting to be a playoff game instead of a middle of bowl season affair. And these teams did not have a good season, but you're still looking at a lot of talent on the sidelines there. And I think in the case of Penn State especially, you saw a lot of fight from them, even as they were going through their really tough stretch there. And I think that because both of these teams had such high expectations and they're now playing each other in this game, there's going to be a little bit of motivation to win it and end the year on a high note. So I expect this game to be a good one. I've been to the Pinstripe Bowl. It's a neat experience as well. And I think these players are going to enjoy playing in it. Number 5, I've got the Cheez-It Citrus Bowl. That is a New Year's Eve game. It's before the college football playoff games on New Year's Eve. So it's a little bit of an opportunity to wet your palate for college football before the big games get started. But it's also a blue blood matchup when you consider Michigan against Texas. A lot going on Michigan's plate right now, so how ready they're going to be for this game is questionable. But I think when you look at that matchup, it is definitely one that'll be watched by college football casuals, if only because they see the names aside from each other. And yeah, I mean it's a big day in college football with the playoff games going on. So if you've already got the television on, why not flip this one on? Number 4, I've got the Rate Bowl. And this is an interesting one, I think, for most people if you hear about the matchup. It is New Mexico against Minnesota. And it's a December 26th game, so a Boxing Day special. And the reason I think this is really going to be a good game is that New Mexico is one of the best stories that has been almost completely overlooked in college football this year. They were supposed to be one of the worst teams in college football. They lost their head coach coming into the year. It was expected to be, at best, a rebuilding year for 2026. And instead, New Mexico ended up qualifying for a bowl. They tied for the Mountain West lead. And because of an unusual tiebreaker scenario that considered computer rankings, the Lobos got left out of the conference title game, the Mountain West Conference title game, in favor of a team that they had already beaten head-to-head. So I think that there's going to be a lot of motivation on this sideline for New Mexico, and they're going to want to show a Power 4 team that they really were a good squad this year, and I think they were. And it's going to be interesting to see how they fare against a Minnesota team who always seems ready to play in bowl season. PJ Fleck is 6-0 as a head coach at the University of Minnesota in bowl games. So this one is going to be, I think, very exciting. You've got a good New Mexico team against a team that is disciplined and will be ready to play in Minnesota. Number 3, I've got the Myrtle Beach Bowl. This is an early game. It is on December 19th, and it is early as far as time is concerned as well. It is an 11 a.m. start, which is going to be tough, I think, for a lot of people, including myself, to watch because it is still during the workday, and many of us are not going to be off for the holidays at this point. But it is, I think, a pretty big game. And, you know, for those that think that the G5 conferences should have their own playoff, this is a game that you should pay attention to because this is basically what you're asking for. Kennesaw State is the Sun Belt champion, and Western Michigan is the MAC champion. So these are two champions of a G5 conference that are facing off in a bowl game. This is basically what you would expect if you had a G5 playoff. So for those that are pushing for that kind of thing to happen, put your money where your mouth is and watch this game because that's what kind of product you would get. And I think it will be good. Number 2, I've got the ReliaQuest Bowl. This is a December 31st bowl game as well, so in theory it's going to be competing for your time along with the Cheez-It Bowl, but this one I think has the opportunity to be even better than the Michigan against Texas face-off, and that is because of the teams that are playing in this game. You've got Vanderbilt against Iowa. Of course, Vanderbilt has had a massively successful season by their standards, and really by most program standards this year. But they were left out of the playoff. Diego Pavia was a Heisman finalist, but I think that he's actually started to create a bit of a heel caricature for himself, and he's starting to become almost like an enemy, I think. I think that it's gone from a situation where he was the underdog at New Mexico State to this guy who was bringing back Vanderbilt to now a guy who almost seems like he's going to be a regular member of the WWE cast after he's done with his football career. And I think that when you look at a team like Iowa and the way that they're usually prepared in bowl season, I think you're going to look at a defense for the Hawkeyes that is going to want to prove something against Diego Pavia. And I would not be surprised at all if you get a really spirited performance from the Iowa defense that puts a lot of pressure on Diego Pavia and keeps what would probably be an otherwise comfortable victory for Vanderbilt. Keep it being, a one-score game throughout its entirety. And we'll see. We'll see if Iowa can get the job done, but I think at the very least they're going to want to make their presence known to Pavia, and he might be waking up a little bit sore after this game, just based on what I think Iowa as a football culture is known for doing, and frankly, I think that the Pavia mania has kind of become a little bit tired for a lot of people across the country. And then number 1, the Pop-Tarts Bowl. This one's pretty easy. This is essentially the playoff consolation bowl. Should have been BYU against Notre Dame, but instead we have BYU against Georgia Tech. Not a bad game at all, though, because I think Haynes King is basically Diego Pavia light and probably a more likable character at this point. And he's going to be taking on a very good BYU defense and a BYU offense that has been pretty successful themselves in the run game. Bear Bachmeier has sold me as a guy who is a gamer. I think that he showed up as kind of what I thought he was earlier in the year as far as his passing ability is concerned, but I expect this game to be really fun as well. And you're looking at two teams who are going to be disappointed that they were left out of the playoff, definitely in the case of BYU. But in the end, I think that they also want to show the country that they were a team that was playing with the big boys this year. And I think in multiple occasions, both already have shown that. So I expect a spirited game in this one as well. So yeah, that's the question of the week is you let me know, are you still interested in bowl season? And if not, why? But if you are, and hopefully you are, and hopefully if you weren't, I was able to convince you with some of those games to watch, let me know. What was your favorite bowl game on the slate that was not a college football playoff game? Interested in your thoughts? Hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode. I plan to be back again before the college football playoff does kick off, but we will probably be hitting different topics given that we are just several days away from that date already. So enjoy the week ahead, enjoy the playoffs, and hopefully you guys will give me some things to think about in the comments as far as your thoughts on bowl season as we kick it off here throughout the week. So appreciate you guys listening, and until next time, take it easy, Shuckers.